A seat, as we are ready to begin. And as we're taking our seats, might I ask you, if you have cell phones or other electronic devices, unless you are on call for emergency purposes, would you set them to silent, please, at this time? My name is Ken Gray, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our session tonight. Welcome to Changing BC's Voting System, Arguments and Facts. Welcome to our special guest, Dr. Dennis Pilon, who is Canada's leading authority on electoral reform. Let us also acknowledge at this time that we gather on the traditional territory of the Kamloops and area First Nation. We acknowledge their care for and working of the land prior to contact with Europeans. Let us work towards healing and reconciliation and a new experience of sharing the land together. Coach Jen, all my relations. Welcome also on behalf of Fair Vote Kamloops, a nonpartisan grassroots organization committed to electoral reform, specifically the implementation of proportional representation here in British Columbia. We welcome in particular all factors of the political spectrum, and those who have no political affiliation whatsoever. Ours is a movement that is powered by people and supported by evidence. This fall, British Columbia will vote on whether to keep our traditional first-past-the-post electoral system or switch to a form of proportional representation. With so many different arguments for and against electoral reform, it's important to look at the evidence for those arguments, hence our invitation to Dr. Pilon tonight. Dennis Pilon is Canada's leading authority on voting systems and electoral reform, having researched the topic for not one, not two, but 3 decades. He is also an expert on the political history of British Columbia. Born in Vancouver, he has lived and worked across British Columbia. He has a BA in Sociology and History and an MA in History from Simon Fraser University and a PhD in Political Science from York University, where he currently teaches. He is the sole author of 2 books, The Politics of Voting, Reforming Canada's Electoral System, and Wrestling with Democracy, Voting Systems as Politics in the 20th Century West. Dennis will speak for approximately 40 minutes, after which we'll take a very quick stretch, and then we'll move into a town hall-style exchange. Details he will announce to us at that time. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you, Dennis. Over to you.
Thank you, Ken. Now, I have a microphone on. Can you hear me? Yes? All right. If I start to fade out, let me know. Well, first, let me thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to come here and present some of the research that I have done in an effort to support this process that's going on in British Columbia. Let me thank all of you for coming out here tonight. A beautiful evening. I'm sure there were other things to do, TV shows to catch up on, but instead you came here, and that is excellent, because wherever you fall on this question, it's important that you are informed. It's important that the things that we say can be based on fact, because that's where we can have a meaningful exchange of ideas and a respectful disagreement if we have different sides on a question. So it's important that we back up the things we say, and I'm hoping that I can contribute to that tonight. So, I'm going to be drawing on my glasses. Now, between October 22nd and November 30th, BC will hold a mail-in referendum on its voting system. And from now until then, you are going to hear a battery of arguments. Lots of people are going to be attempting to get your attention with all sorts of flashy statements about utopia or chaos. Not all arguments are created equal. Not all arguments can be supported by recourse to facts. Some are based on just assertions. A lot are based on speculation. What if? Could this happen? Others are just generalizations, not rooted in any kind of recourse to facts. And of course, some are based on facts. So Tonight, I want to explore what evidence can be found to support the various claims that we've already heard. And of course, BC is not new to this topic, right? There's been 2 referendums, a long history of electoral reform in the province at both the provincial and municipal level. Now, why should you listen to me? Well, Ken's already suggested that I know a little bit about the topic. So in terms of my publications, Wrestling with Democracy looks at 18 countries over 150 years, basically every single instance of national voting system reform across Western industrialized countries. So I know a little bit about how other countries have come to have the voting systems that they do, and what has been the process of change and reform. What characterizes that? What has been involved? I have spent a lot of time studying British Columbia, and it's fascinating politics. I know other people in the country, they look down on British Columbia. British Columbia, it's a bit wild out there, but I love British Columbia politics. It's interesting, and so I've written a lot about it. My book, The Politics of Voting, looks at the case for electoral reform in Canada. So what are the particular issues that have been raised? Why have people thought it's an important topic? Why have other people resisted it? What about Canadian elections have raised these concerns? I've also been paying close attention to the more recent voting system reform efforts across the country. So in British Columbia, the efforts of Gordon Campbell's Liberal government with its Citizens' Assembly, and then the 2 referendums, the work that's been done in PEI, there have been 2 referendums there, efforts for reform in Ontario and Quebec. And as you can see, more updates on British Columbia. I've looked at the role that different groups in civil society have played. So the corporate sector, labor as a group. So lots of research that I've been able to do on this question, and I'm offering as a kind of resource to the public. Now, what is the difference between an evidence-based approach and other approaches? What distinguishes someone who's working from evidence from these other claims? Well, I would argue that evidence-based approaches are different than, say, partisan or ideological claims, which are often true to the people who hold those claims because they think them, because they link with their values, because they respond to their sense of what has gone on. But that doesn't necessarily back up with any other kinds of evidence. The difference is that investigators who are drawing from evidence clearly set out the criteria that they are using for assessing the evidence. And importantly, the evidence can be checked by others. That's crucial. It's not crucial whether or not the person who's putting forward the evidence may in themselves have an opinion on the question. What's important is that others can check that evidence to see that that evidence is valid. Now, it's usually the case that researchers don't have a vested interest in the outcome. And again, I want to stress, that doesn't mean they don't have an opinion on it. I mean, John Courtney, a very esteemed Canadian political scientist, wrote a book on independent boundary commissions. So he looked at the ways in which people could draw the boundaries for different federal ridings. Of course, traditional way was that the parties did it. And he researched this, and he came forward and said, well, there's this other way, independent boundary commissions. And he said, I think it's a good idea, based on what he looked at. What was important about his work was that all of the claims that he made were verifiable. Someone else could go and check those claims and say, yeah, that lines up. That matches up with what we can see in the record. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the arguments for change, some of the typical ones we hear. If the arguments for change were a record, then I'm going to look at the greatest hits. I'm not going to look at those deep cuts on the album. I'm just going to look at the big ones, the ones that you've probably already heard. At the same time, I'm going to look at the arguments against change. So let's look at some of the greatest hits. We often hear those who are in favor of change claim that a move to a proportional system will make votes count more effectively, or make every vote count. We've heard them suggest that it will result in more accurate representation of party voter strength. We've heard them claim that majority governments will represent a majority of government, a majority of voters. The implication, of course, being that that is not the case now, or not normally. That change will lead to cooperation across parties, more transparent government in terms of spending and policy, better representation of diversity, and higher voter turnout. And I don't want to be accused of putting words in anyone's mouth, so here's a quote from Fair Vote Canada BC. And from their website, they say that with PR, almost every vote will count to define the makeup of the legislature, and almost every voter will help to elect a representative who shares their values. All regions will have representation in both government and as part of the opposition, and a single party will no longer be able to attain a majority government with just 40% of the vote. Cooperation and compromise, they claim, will become the norm. What about the no side? What about those who are against change? What are the arguments that we hear from them typically? Well, we often hear that the current system works just fine. It's simple, stable, and successful. This is the slogan of the No campaign. We hear that the reform process is rigged in favor of change and against rural British Columbia. We've heard that the PR choices are biased to favor a long-term governing association between the NDP and the Greens, or that the PR choices themselves are untried or complicated, or the referendum process is complicated. We've heard that the adoption of PR will lead to instability, extremism, party dominance, party fragmentation, loss of voter control over government formation, and many other claims. But again, let's look at their website. So the Vote No to Pro Rep, the group that will be hoping to take up the No campaign, a quote from their website, they say that proportional representation severs the link between citizens and members of the legislature and lets political parties decide who is to form government rather than citizens. Proportional representation allows small, single-issue parties to get a foothold in the legislature. BC is a stable, highly functioning, and successful democracy. There is no need, in their view, to fix it. Well, how do we approach this task? How do we draw evidence to assess the claims that the different sides are making? Now, a first rule of comparative study in the study of political science is that you have to compare like with like. In other words, you have to compare comparable countries. You know, we're not going to compare Canada to Zimbabwe. Different thing going on there, right? You're going to need to come up with a comparison of countries that are roughly similar in terms of their economic and political development, precisely so that you can pick out those things that are different. The time period. We're going to look at the post-war period. Why? Because we see the consolidation of modern democratic government across Western industrialized countries in this period. And what are the sources of evidence? Well, there's going to be academic research, there's going to be government reports, reports of non-governmental organizations, election results. And why do we look here? Because again, usually these researchers have no axe to grind, right? They've got no stick in the game, right? They don't directly benefit necessarily from one system or another. Now, I just want to say, as Ken suggested, that I've got a presentation, I'm going to run through this stuff, but this is your meeting, and if you decide after I've gone through all this that, you know, that's enough of that, and you'd rather talk about something else related to our topic, then I'm happy to talk about that. So I just wanted to, you know, if you're like, wow, this sounds like it's going to be a snore fest, relax. When we get to the questions and answers, I'm sure things will heat up, and I really want you to drive what we do in that section. All right, let's begin. Arguments for change. What is the evidence? Starting with making votes count more effectively. Now, this one really gets up the nose of supporters of First Past the Post, because they say, what do you mean the system doesn't make every vote count? I mean, you can't even work out what a plurality is if you don't know what all the votes are. And of course, in that, they're technically correct. It is technically correct to say that the plurality system requires you to count up all the votes precisely so you can figure out what the plurality is, which competitor, which party has the most votes. But that's kind of missing the point that the critics are raising. For the critics mean something else by making every vote count. The critics mean, does the voting system translate as many votes as possible into representation, right? How many of the voters cast a ballot and then can say that they have a representative that shares their broad outlook or views? And here I've drawn from Fair Vote Canada. They've got a snappy slide, and you know, we could do this ourselves. I'm using this because I think it's quite an effective representation. But if we went through and added up the votes in any number of Western industrialized countries that use proportional voting and First Past the Post voting, the results would be roughly similar. In other words, if we went to the latest results in Sweden and we looked at the votes that were cast and we said, hey, how many of these votes have translated into a proportionate amount of representation? The facts are a whole lot of them have. So the claim that the proponents make, that under PR all votes would count in terms of seeing those votes turned into representation, is roughly supported by the evidence that we can draw from election results. Now, not exactly, because no proportional system exactly mirrors what the public says, precisely because many systems have thresholds that, cut off the smallest parties. If they don't get 4 or 5%, they don't get any seats. So that's why there's a bit of a gap here between complete proportionality. But as you can see, some countries come very close. Denmark, 99%, Sweden, 96%, and New Zealand, a country very similar to ourselves in terms of its political and constitutional development, having almost 94%. Now, you compare that to British Columbia, or you compare that to Canadian results, and it's much more around 50%. Only 50% of the votes could be said to have translated into representation that the voters had suggested they wanted. What about the claim that PR would lead to more accurate representation of party voter strength? In other words, to what extent would a PR system see the results for parties mirror the proportion of support that they got in votes? So does the proportion of seats match the proportion of votes? And here, political scientists have come up with a number of techniques to try to test this. This is a disproportionality index. So here what researchers do is they say, all right, what are the election results? And what's the gap between proportionality and disproportionality? What's the gap between what the votes were and the seats that were gotten by the parties, right? Let's say a party got, 25% of the vote, but they only got 20% of the seats. Well, that gap is what the political scientists are measuring. And what they've discovered in looking at a number of recent elections, and you can see on this slide, is that the countries that use what we call winner-take-all systems, so plurality voting systems, majority voting systems, systems like ours, they're at the top in terms of the largest amount of disproportionality. In other words, these systems regularly have a fairly large gap between what the voters said with their votes and what the seats turned out to be. And of course, as we move down the chart, as we move into the countries that use proportional system, then the index shrinks. So the gap between what voters said with their votes and the seats that they got is much narrower. And again, not one-to-one, as you can see. There's some differences between or amongst the different PR systems, but certainly as a group, the PR systems are closer and the plurality systems are further. If we look at a recent election, this most recent election in New Zealand, we can see that the results in terms of the popular vote for the parties is very close, within 2 or 3% of the support. And so the claim that PR systems, roughly speaking, reward parties proportionately, proportion vote, proportion of the seat, that is backed up by the evidence that we could bring to bear on the question. All right, what about the claims about majority government, right? One of the claims that we hear from supporters of proportional representation is that, unlike now, where our majority governments seldom represent a majority of the voters, because Justin Trudeau's Liberals, won a majority government with 39.5% of the vote, and before them, the federal Conservatives under Stephen Harper won a majority of seats with 39.5% of the vote. So those governments are majority governments in terms of seats, but not in terms of their public support. So, is it true to say that under a PR system, we would see more governments where the majority of seats does actually represent a majority of the voters? Now here I just wanted to draw your attention to some recent BC election results, and what we can see in these results is that very seldom does our present voting system see that the government that wins a majority of the seats also has a majority of the votes. We have one case, 2001. In 2001, the Provincial Liberal Party did win a majority of the votes. Now, for that, they won 97% of the seats. Bit of an overstatement. Not quite what British Columbians had said with their votes, but that is what tends to happen in First Past the Post. When a party is very popular, the voting system makes them very, very popular. Now, in the rest of the examples, we can see that no single party got a majority of the popular vote. Nonetheless, in almost every case, those parties won a majority of the seats, except, of course, this most recent election, 2017. So we see a trend here in terms of plurality. Plurality does indeed not usually create a majority government that reflects a majority of the voters. Now, if we turn to recent election results in New Zealand, and I'm just using this as an illustrative example, So here we've got 8 elections since New Zealand introduced their proportional voting system for the first election in 1996. 8 elections. So I thought, well, let's look 8 elections into the past. What about the 8 elections under First Past the Post before they adopted their proportional voting system? And what we see is that before they adopted their proportional voting system, like British Columbia, they tended to have single-party majority governments that did not win a majority of the popular vote. However, after they adopted PR, it was much less likely that a single party would win a majority of the popular vote and get, would get a minority of the popular vote, but still win a majority of the seats. In fact, what we see is that in most cases, a coalition of parties had to be put together to create that majority. And so in the end, the government did represent a majority of the voters, but of course not just in a single party. And this also answers our next question, which is cooperation across parties. So one of the claims that PR supporters make is that under a PR system, we would see cooperation across parties. And what we see in the New Zealand case is that that is indeed the case. On both the right and the left, we have seen different coalitions put together to govern as a majority coalition. Of course, if we go back to British Columbia, we don't see that occurring. Except, of course, in the most recent case. In the most recent case, where no single party had a majority of seats, we did see a coalition of sorts, not an official coalition, but an agreement for supply and confidence. So in other words, an agreement between 2 parties that one party would support another on questions of supply, in other words, the budget. Right? If you don't have a budget, you can't really govern. And on confidence. In other words, can the government stand? Will it be allowed to continue? And an agreement from that party that they would support them. What about the arguments that PR would lead to more transparent government in terms of spending decisions, in terms of policy development? Now, this is a tougher question and would require a great deal more research than I can offer you tonight. But I think it's an important thing for us to think about. I think the concerns are the policy process. What is the policy process like under different voting systems? Is there something distinctly different about the way that governments do policy under PR as opposed to First Past the Post? And I just want to outline what I think are some of those concerns. The concerns involve policy development. So how quickly does policy get developed and implemented? What's the kind of research? How broad is the research? How balanced is the research that is backing up that policy development? And what is the feedback that has been received from stakeholders, from interested members of the public? And it's also a question of policy influence. Who can influence the shape of that legislation? Is it well-financed lobbyists? Is it community members? And then who has the power to make the policy go forward? In other words, a degree of policy agreement. And who has a policy veto? What kind of players can intervene to prevent policy from coming forward? Are they governing coalition members? Are they the public? Are they vested interests? Well, again, as I say, I don't have any decisive evidence on this. But I do think that there have been a number of policy issues in British Columbia that have raised concerns about the way in which the policy has moved forward. Now, today on the local radio station, the interviewer asked me, what about the Coquihalla? Would a proportional system have prevented, strong action on building that highway? Well, it's hard to say. Hard to say because, of course, one would have had to ask a question about, how much support was there for building that highway across the political spectrum? I don't know the answer to that question. But I can say that there are a number of issues that after the fact people thought, maybe we should have moved a little slower on those ones, right? So the fast ferries issue, the BC rail sale, the Site C dam approval, the ICBC surplus and deficits. These are policy issues that have raised concerns about the way in which policy has been developed. And I think it's worth considering to what extent do those failures, are they outweighed by the benefits of the way that policy can be developed under First Past the Post? Or do these policy debacles suggest that there needs to be some view of the alternatives? What about the claims that a PR system would lead to a better representation of diversity? Well, here we have, I've gone to the my source here is the Interparliamentary Union. This is a nonpartisan group connected with the European Union, and they collect data on a whole host of demographic factors connected with legislatures. This is the most recent data that they have produced on the representation of women. And it is interesting to see the way in which the different countries sort of bulk together in terms of the results that they produce. So as we can see, the top countries in terms of the representation of women are almost all PR countries. Now, these are the most recent results, 2018, and I do want to emphasize that no voting system is an absolute barrier to the representation of diversity. We have seen all voting systems become inclusive of women, of racial minorities, of immigrant groups, of gays and lesbians, of all different kinds of groups. The question is, how quickly have the countries responded to new demands? And here, if we look at this data over time, what we see is that the proportional countries did more quickly address some of these concerns coming up from civil society, whereas the plurality systems, the majority systems, were typically much slower. And I can go into some details about what the research says about why that is the case in the question and answer period if you want me to. Looking at the most recent results in New Zealand, I think, are particularly relevant for British Columbia on the question of Indigenous representation. And up until the introduction of their PR system, you can see there's a fairly flat line on Indigenous representation. You know, Indigenous people in New Zealand are a considerable group, 20% of the population. And their representation was fairly flat. And that's because they were awarded 4 seats in the legislature as designated Maori seats. And those seats were established in 1867. And they didn't change until 1996. So from 1867 to 1996, 4 Maori in the legislature. And after 1996, some very interesting and dynamic results. Dramatic increase in Maori representation, basically rising to their proportional level in the society. So from 4 or 5% before to about 17, 18% after. And another interesting development was that before the adoption of proportional representation, basically one party was the power party of the Maori, the Labour Party. They were seen as a more social justice-oriented party, more open to some of the claims of the Maori. After the introduction of proportional representation, all of the parties started to seek out Maori representatives to run for their parties. And indeed, Maori representatives were elected with every major party. So this is an interesting and I think quite exciting development, certainly one that bears scrutiny given the demographic profile of this province. What about higher voter turnout? This has got to be one of the top greatest hits. I mean, it is on regular rotation amongst those who are in favor of voting system reform. They say that a new voting system, a proportional voting system will drive up voter turnout. And of course, I think we're all very concerned about voter turnout. If people aren't participating in our democracy, do they have a stake in what's going on? And I think we want them to have a stake in our democracy. But the evidence on voter turnout is more mixed than some of the proponents might like. So it is true that on average, proportional voting systems have higher voter turnout than countries that have majority or plurality voting systems. However, voter turnout has fallen across all Western industrialized countries. So even PR systems have seen a drop in their voter turnout. And so what this chart shows you is that over this period from the 40s to the most recent period, there's been a drop from somewhere around 80 to 85% voter turnout in PR countries to about 70%, so a 15% drop. Now, in plurality countries, the rates were different, right? So they started at about 70, 75% voter turnout, and they've fallen to 50, 55%. So in that sense, I mean, non-PR countries have fallen further, in some cases fallen faster, but it would be wrong to say that PR could necessarily reverse the trends, because in PR countries, they've also seen a fall in voter turnout. So in that case, the claim is, I think, more mixed. This slide put together by the Conference Board of Canada, though, does show the basic facts that PR countries, on average, have higher voter turnout. Not all of them. Switzerland is down with the other FirstPastThePost countries, majority countries. It is the one PR country in that group. But otherwise, the PR countries tend to be much higher. So if we review the claims, that have been made on the PR side in terms of the evidence that could be marshaled to support them, we can see that many of the claims can be supported. Many of them can be backed up by some evidence from comparative experience or from elections. The policy process, that is a plausible case, though I think that more research would need to be done to really tell us more about that policy process. And of course, the voter turnout question is mixed. So I think we need to recognize some of the nuance there. All right, what about the arguments against change? What have the groups who are against changing our voting system? Of course, by implication, they are endorsing the current system. They're saying the current system is good and that people should support it. What are they saying? Well, as I've suggested, they've said that the current system works fine, that it's simple, stable, and successful. Now, these claims can't really be examined factually because they're value statements. I mean, how do you judge works fine? I mean, that's pretty much in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? That it's simple, stable, and successful would require us to define all those terms to be able to say whether we agree with that or not. But the other claims, I think, are more open to us investigating. So let's move on to those, starting with the idea that the reform process is rigged for change. Now, this claim is based, I think, in reading the claims that have been made, on the fact that there is this ballot structure. So this is the ballot structure that the government has put forward for the referendum. And it is a two-part question, starting with a mandate question. Do you support the current system, or do you want an alternative proportional system? And then, regardless of whether you support that or not, which of the proportional systems would you prefer if indeed that's what the province is doing? Now, a number of proponents of not changing have said this is rigged. This is rigging the game for change. Now, I don't really get what they're on about. I don't really see how this is a rigged ballot. It seems to me that what the government has tried to do is to get at what voters really want. If the government had gone with a question that offered first past the post versus some alternative, then the problem would be people might want change, but they might not agree on the alternative. And so then we haven't really gotten to know what the public wants. I mean, if the public says, we'll keep first past the post because I don't like the alternative, then we haven't really found out what they wanted. We just found out what they'll put up with. What the government has tried to do here is to say, all right, do you want change or not? Yes or no? And then, what kind of change would you like? And I think it's important to recognize that I think the government has moved in this way. I mean, I'm not privy to the government discussions, so I don't know why they made the choices they did. But I can say that the choices that the government has put on the ballot respond to the criticisms that came from the critics of the process in the past and more recently. So critics have said, we need a system where the voters are in complete charge of who gets elected. Well, that's the DMP system. Critics have said, we need a system that treats rural British Columbia differently. Well, that's rural-urban PR. Critics have said, we need a system that's off the shelf that everybody knows. Well, that's MMP. So in that sense, I mean, what we see here is a government that is actually responding to the criticisms. What I find interesting about these criticisms that have come recently is that this ballot structure is the structure that was used in New Zealand. In New Zealand in 1992, they had an indicative ballot that asked people, do you want to keep the current system, or would you like to consider another voting system? And then voters were given a list of options. Now, what's interesting about that was that at the time, critics of the current system said the government is rigging the system not to change. In other words, in New Zealand at the time, people thought that the government was trying to pull a fast one. By putting this kind of ballot forward, they thought it was privileging the status quo rather than a change. So it's kind of ironic that today, now, we have the critics of change saying this is rigging it to change. When we look at the various referendums and ballots that we've seen used around the world on these kinds of questions, this ballot is very clear and straightforward. So I don't think that, given what we've seen in the past, the claims that this is somehow rigging things for change. I mean, look, if people don't want change, all they have to do is say they want to keep first past the post. And if a majority of British Columbians say that they don't want change, they won't get it. I mean, I don't see how anyone can claim this is rigged. It's pretty straight up, right? If you get a majority who say they want to keep first past the post, that's what you're going to keep. What about the claim that this process and this ballot is rigged against rural British Columbia. The BC Liberal Party was fast out of the gate with the claim that the process and the decision rule and the proportional models was going to rig the game against rural British Columbia. And this map, this visual, really makes that case, right? The assumption being that urban British Columbia is going to vote as a bloc to screw over rural British Columbia. I'm just going to use some technical language here. You know, the problem with this assumption is that it doesn't really match what voters do. I mean, is it true to say that rural British Columbia is one voting bloc, that everybody in rural British Columbia agrees about everything, and everybody in urban British Columbia, like they're just two warring groups that, you know, are behind their kind of moat and, you know, don't agree about anything? I mean, if we turn to some evidence, like what people voted in the election, it doesn't appear so, right? So if we look at just the results of a plurality election, we see that rural British Columbia and urban British Columbia are not monolithic political blocs, right? Some people in rural British Columbia support the New Democrats, some support the Liberals, and some people in urban British Columbia support the Liberals, and some support the NDP. Now, this claim by the Liberals that, you know, urban British Columbia is going to gang up on rural British Columbia, I mean, I don't know. Why don't those urban Liberals have a chat with their rural friends? I mean, you know, they're both voting for the same party. I can't believe that they would not have some communication between them. Of course, the results under First Past the Post don't tell the whole story. I mean, here we can see, just on the face of it, in terms of our regular elections, that the Liberals are, this breaks down, I borrowed this from Chad Skelton, I thought it was a nice visual of the election results, dividing the province between, you know, how he defines urban British Columbia and rural British Columbia. There could be some disputes on exactly how to draw those lines, but this works in terms of a visual representation. So in terms of the results in the election, you've got the metro urban results, and you've got the rest of BC. And what's interesting here is that while the New Democrats clearly dominate urban British Columbia, the Liberals are no slouch. They're not without something. I mean, they won 18 seats in urban British Columbia. And of course, in rural British Columbia, while the Liberals are far and away the winners of the plurality races, the New Democrats also picked up some support in rural British Columbia. But the problem, of course, with the seat count in First Past the Post is it dramatically underestimates the real diversity of opinions in these different regions. And when we look at the popular vote, the votes that were cast in these different areas, what we discover is that both urban and rural British Columbia are very diverse places politically. So in this case, you know, 36% of urban British Columbians voted Liberal. But here's the interesting thing. In rural British Columbia, half of voters supported the Liberals, but half supported the other parties. Half supported the New Democrats and Greens. Now, of course, that was not reflected in the seat count. The Liberals were much more successful at turning their 50% into, you know, much more of the seat count. So this challenges this vision that somehow urban and rural British Columbia are warring states entirely separate. This complicates that claim, I think, a great deal. Well, what about the claim that the voting system, the PR choices on the ballot, favor a long-term coalition of governing between the Democrats and the Greens? I mean, basically what we're hearing is that the NDP is trying to rig this system to keep themselves in power forever. Well, that sounds bad. I mean, I think we'd all agree that that's not a good thing. Not a good thing that any party could expect to rig the game in a way that they would stay in power forever. Now, is this what occurs in PR systems? Is it fair to say that if British Columbia adopted a PR system, that is the result that we could expect? It doesn't appear to be the case in terms of what's happened in other countries. So other countries, and I'm just using the MMP model because that's one of the ones that's on the ballot. If we look at what has actually occurred in countries that use these systems, we do not see that kind of monolithic political behavior. What we see is that the center-right is in power for a time, and the center-left is in power for a time, and sometimes the right and left join against the center. You know, Germany is a very interesting example of some creative coalition making. So the idea that, in British Columbia, one kind of coalition dynamic could hold forever is belied by the kinds of dynamic results that we see in these other countries. Again, New Zealand, a country that is very similar to Canada in terms of its political and constitutional development and legacies. Right coalition comes to power in the first PR election, then the left comes to power for a few elections, then the right comes back to power for a few elections, and then the left comes back to power. So the assumption that we're hearing from the No campaign and from the Liberal Party, I think does a disservice to the political right. I find it hard to believe that under a different voting system, the political right in this province could not rejig its game to be competitive, right? To come up with some sort of alternative coalition dynamics. At least the evidence from afar suggests that it's very unlikely that political relationships would remain static under a different voting system. What about the claims that these other PR systems are untried? This is, they've gotten this political science professor from the University of Toronto to come out and say, oh, it's very terrifying, these choices on the ballot. I mean, some of them have never been used anywhere. What a dangerous experiment for British Columbia. Side issue, I'm not convinced that expert is really, very well informed about how voting systems work, because if he was, he would know, of course, that mixed member proportional has quite a long history of use in other countries. But he would also know that the other two models are not that far away from things that have been used in other places. If we look at the rural-urban proportional system, this system is similar to a system that we have used in this country. We used a mixed system, so we combined two different voting systems for provincial elections in Alberta and Manitoba. So for 35 years, those provinces used a mixed system that combined SDV for urban areas and the alternative vote, or a majority voting system, for the rural areas. Did everything fall apart? Did people freak out? Were there riots in the streets? No. This happened after the Winnipeg General Strike. So 35 years, literally millions of Canadians, Canadians who, by the way, were farmers mostly, whose education levels were, grade 7, grade 8. They could handle it. They didn't seem to have any problem using this mixed system. And what the rural-urban proportional system does, essentially, is combine the single transferable vote with the mixed member proportional system. And I think many of you know that both of these systems have been used around the world, in some cases for 100 years. So there's lots of experience. All we're doing here is combining them into one voting system. And as I say, we've done this already in other provinces for decades. Now, the dual member proportional system is an innovation. No one has used this exact system anywhere. And it was developed by a very clever fellow, Sean Graham, a Canadian, and he developed it because he wanted to come up with a system that would grapple with the geographic challenges of Canada, right? We got not that many people and a whole lot of geography. And how do we come up with a system that can manage that? And so he came up with this very clever system that not only tried to address the geographic issues, but also addressed the feeling that people had that maybe party lists weren't their thing. Some people have got this kind of, I don't know, I'm not really comfortable with the idea of a party list. Well, what the DMP system does is basically put the party list creation into the hands of the voters directly. So the dual member system is basically a variation of mixed member proportional. Mixed member proportional, of course, has single member ridings, and then it tops up those ridings with a pool of seats to try to make the results proportional. Well, in a sense, that's all the dual member proportional system is doing. It elects a member from a riding, and then it takes the results from those individual contests, and it uses that to figure out which candidates will go where on a party list for each party. And who decides that? The voters would decide that. So it's kind of an interesting innovation. It's certainly responding to the things that people have heard throughout British Columbia and these